Happy Sunday, everyone. Welcome to Our Issues Birmingham. I'm Tommy Spina. Today's guest is Bennet Wright. Bennet is the Executive Director of the Alabama Sentencing Commission. And as we all know, we have tremendous issues going on in our community with jail overcrowding, for starters. So let's start there.
Sure.
The governor has said she was just going to build some more prisons. That's not going to really solve the problem, is it?
Just prison construction by itself will not solve the problem.
And can we afford it?
That is a whole separate conversation. I think one of the major issue facing the state is the state really hasn't paid the proper attention to the Alabama Department of Corrections probably since its inception. Alabama has a historic level of underfunding the prison system, and the decades-long issue of that has all kind of coalesced right now. So the state, unfortunately, in very short order, is going to have to come up with a short-term, intermediate term, and a long-term solution in short order, which is very difficult, especially given the state's limited resources.
Mm-hmm. Just the time. Well, you go ahead.
No, I think there are a lot of things that we have more national attention on the state of Alabama, which is really pushing Alabama. We have a recent letter from the U.S. Department of Justice that was sent to the governor that outlined 62 pages of concerns that the Department of Justice has with the prison system. Alabama's prison system has historically been the most overcrowded in the country. The level of crowding has been brought down, but significant issues remain.
Well, what facilitated bringing them down, for starters?
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you say bringing it down, it went from 200% occupancy to 160-something% occupancy. Are we still at that number?
We are. The prison population in Alabama kind of reached its zenith approximately 6 years ago. In 2012, 2013, Alabama was incarcerating just in Alabama facilities almost 27,000 inmates. At last year, Alabama's prison population got down to almost 20,000. So there was almost a 7,000 inmate reduction.
Which could be attributed to what?
There really have been a couple of major reforms that Alabama has engaged in over the last 6 to 7 years. In 2013, the state migrated towards presumptive sentencing guidelines for drug and property offenders. And what that means is the courts are required to follow a set of sentencing guidelines absent extraordinary factors in those nonviolent cases. In 2016, the state engaged the Council for State Governments and went through what's commonly called as the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, which had further reforms across the system, including further sentencing reforms, tweaks to Alabama's criminal statutes, and then some parole reform as well. What's interesting is quite recently, within the last year, there was a real tragic case involving an inmate named Jimmy Lee Spencer that was paroled, and upon parole, Jimmy Lee Spencer went out and murdered multiple individuals. The parole rate in wake of that tragedy has just plummeted. And so recently, within the last year, Alabama's prison population has begun to spike back up, and that's directly traceable back to the plummeting parole rate. So,
and what number are we at as we speak?
We're at approximately 21,000.
Okay.
So one of the issues that you raised was prison construction. Alabama has never adequately built facilities or maintained those facilities. So I think both arguments on both sides of this are kind of primarily false. The argument that you can build your way out of the crisis, absolutely false. On the other end of the argument, it's not as simple as, well, we just don't build, we save money. That's not true. The existing facilities we have almost $800 million of unmet capital improvements. So if the state's not going to build, you have to be willing to pump in almost $800 million just into the existing facilities. So there really is no free option. Both options require money. And so that's really why I say it's kind of a false narrative on both sides. You can build your way out of it, not true. And then if you don't build, you can save that money and divert that money. That's not true either.
Well, we don't have that money, do we?
That's correct. That's why on really either option, I think would have to be some sort of bond. You're looking at, and as there's two options. One of the options that the governor put out there was the governor has the authority to float a bond independent of the legislature. Well, the legislature would have to turn around and appropriate the money to probably pay for that bond.
Mm-hmm.
Then the legislature, if they wanted to pass legislation, they would have the ability to actually float a bond out for that as well. So there's really two different bond options out there.
And that would be the only way to get it financed. So,
realistically, yes.
and then you have the issue with staffing.
In,
We're understaffed as we speak.
Incredibly understaffed, and I think this is the issue that is the underpinning for a lot of the problems. If that doesn't get fixed, it really doesn't matter what Alabama does. We're going to continue to have a crisis. In the existing facilities that we have right now, the state of Alabama is authorized or should have 3,400 corrections officers. We only have 1,100. We have 1/3 of the staffing level that we currently need.
And that number comes from sort of like a teacher-student ratio that schools try to achieve.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the difficult things, and I always hear people use analogies like that. What people forget about prisons, unlike schools, they're 24/7 operations. You know, a prison never ever shuts down. It doesn't shut down on holidays. They're constantly open. You really need a kind of a cushion of officers. You have obviously you can only work so many hours per week. You have holidays, you have sick leave, so it's incumbent upon to have that many officers. And it's not good to have an officer working huge shifts.
Yeah.
That's really not a job where you want to get fatigue on a daily basis.
We'll talk some more about solutions to that problem when we come back from break.
Thank you.
This is Our Issues Birmingham. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Our Issues Birmingham. I'm talking with Bennet Wright with the Alabama Sentencing Commission. We're talking about the state of prisons in the state of Alabama, which is deplorable. Is that a good word?
Probably fairly accurate.
You mentioned the ratio of corrections officer to inmate and how understaffed we are. Does that spill into, it's open 365 days a year, 24/7. Somebody's going to have an appendicitis. Somebody's going to have mental health needs. How are we dealing with that?
Sure.
And I think that was a subject of the report that you referenced that came out from the federal government, and also address what kind of constraints we're under from the judge in Montgomery.
Sure. The state of Alabama is currently in federal court on mental health care. That's the state is in settlement talks with the other party about that, and then there's also a pending
The lack of mental health care.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then there's a pending lawsuit about the delivery of physical health care. Inmates have a constitutional right to adequate physical health care and mental health care. I think that's why Alabama is currently in federal court is many people don't think that is adequate. One of the dangerous things that I think I hear in public is that they think that we need to save money in the corrections arena. I don't think it's possible to save one penny. And I think if the Alabama saved one penny, we'd be right back in federal court. Alabama has underfunded virtually every aspect of the corrections system. We really haven't maintained our facilities. There's no mechanism to save money there. That's going to be going up in cost. We don't have enough correctional officers. That's going to cost more money to hire extra officers. The legislature this session did pass a pay increase for officers. That's going to cost more money. We're in federal court because of our physical health care and our mental health care capacity. In order to improve those, that's going to go up. So every major driving factor in DOC's budget has to go up. And so anytime I hear anyone talk about the word savings, that's just not possible. And to even talk about you can save money, I think, is irresponsible. You can definitely avert future costs, but to save money right now, that is not possible. The actual amount of money that Alabama spends on corrections is significantly lower than surrounding states as well.
Per inmate,
Well, per inmate or just for the
in general.
in general for actually the whole entire system. I think a good point of reference is Tennessee, the actual state that borders us on the north. Tennessee has approximately 2,000 extra people in prison than we do here in Alabama. They supervise virtually the same number of people on probation or parole. If you added together DOC's most recent budget and Pardons and Parole's most recent budget together, you're looking at about $550 million. If you look at Tennessee, you combine those two budgets, it's almost $1.05 billion.
So we're halfway there.
Almost halfway there. And so even if you look at geographical comparative states, it's just the funding is a little bit out of whack.
Well, what do you say to the guy who's watching, or the gal who's watching, who says, well, it's prison. It's not supposed to be a walk in the park. It's not supposed to be the Four Seasons or the Hilton. What do you say to that person?
I would say that the existing facilities that Alabama has are surely not the Hilton or the Ritz. Regardless of what people think about the correction systems in every state, they have to meet constitutional muster. The state of Alabama has to provide a level of safety. That's one of the issues that the Department of Justice raised in their report, was that they said they had reason to believe that Alabama could not protect inmates from other inmate violence. They cannot protect inmates from other inmate sexual assault. The Department of Justice also said they had concerns about safe and humane conditions. So while John Q or Jane Q Citizen may say they don't want that, you have to have that, and that costs money.
What could ultimately happen if Alabama's DOC and legislative group doesn't step up to the plate to comply with what the federal government, Department of Justice, I mean, when I say federal government, has said about our system? Where could that go?
There are various different options. But I think what the people of Alabama need to understand is that you do not want to cede state or local control of any entity of government to the federal government. Basically what you're doing then is you're turning over the financial decisions and responsibility that you control locally. You're allowing someone else to make those decisions.
Well, they don't want that either, I wouldn't think. I mean, don't they have, I mean, we have 2 million people in prison, in excess of 2 million people in prison in this country.
Correct.
So comparatively speaking, where does Alabama fall in terms of volume of inmates versus size of state?
Sure.
Is Tennessee the best comparison?
Well, I think if you look at it across the country, a lot of southern states have higher rates of incarceration per capita. That's also why a lot of southern states have recently gone through major criminal justice reforms. You've seen Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Alabama have all gone through major reforms to, I think, combat their tough on crime policies that were actually passed decades ago. It's actually a little bit like trying to turn a ship on a dime. You know, you really have a whole system that for decades long has been on one course. It's not just that easy to flip a switch and completely reverse course. But I think you do see a lot of states like Alabama that are trying to really change. The problem is we have to change virtually every aspect of the system, and that's tough given the resources, and it's tough given the politics.
Hold that thought. We're going to talk about the guidelines and what they've done and what they're doing and what's in store for the future when we come back.
Sure.
This is Our Issues Birmingham. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Our Issues Birmingham. To borrow from an old song, we're talking about the condition our condition is in, which is not good. So we have these sentencing guidelines nowadays. They're not mandatory in every instance.
That's correct.
They are not necessarily binding on a court. But have we developed some statistical, empirical data to be able to see if judges are in fact following them?
Sure. And as you referenced, there are sentencing guidelines that are binding on the courts for drug and property offenses, and then we have sentencing guidelines for personal offenses that are violent offenses that are actually not binding. And it's no surprise that the binding guidelines for drug and property offenses are followed the overwhelming majority of the time, where actually some of the guidelines for the more violent offenses are not. I think it's really not just about the overall effect of the guidelines. I think what needs to be discussed is equity and fairness as well. I think one of the impetuses for the guidelines was prior to just 6 years ago, you could have offenders on two different sides of the state that committed exactly the same crime, that had the same criminal history or lack of criminal history, and they could get wildly different sentences. And so I think there was
Has that disparity been diminished?
It has, especially for drug and property offenses. Just as little as 6 years ago, it was possible in Alabama to receive a life sentence for possession of a small amount of drugs if, in fact, you had significant criminal history.
Right.
And so I think that's a little bit disturbing to contemplate the taxpayer expense for incarcerating someone for life for possession of a small amount.
And that would include possession of marijuana.
It would.
So there's been some movement in the state of Alabama to address what's going on with marijuana across the country. Can you speak to that issue and whether there's any reality to relief there? I know they've established a marijuana commission to study what they should do about that law. They came close to some legislation that was going to decriminalize marijuana. Are you familiar with that
Yes, I would.
piece of work?
I don't think Alabama will decriminalize marijuana anytime soon. I think in the Alabama legislature, almost every session, you have various proposals about ways to deal with the penalties for marijuana possession or use, and those pieces of legislation cover they really cover a wide gamut. I think as it just relates to the prison issue, I hear a lot of times if Alabama just legalized marijuana, that could solve part of the prison problem.
I don't think so.
No.
People aren't really going to jail for marijuana.
Correct. There are less than 100 offenders in the Alabama Department of Corrections that are there for a marijuana offense. So I think this gets back.
Well, that's encouraging.
It's
surprising too, as a matter of fact.
Well, sure, and those numbers have been steadily going down. Even the amount of people in prison for drug possession has decreased drastically.
Well, we've created a new class of felony.
That's correct.
For starters.
That's right.
And for those of you that don't understand, Alabama historically has had 3 classes of felony, A, B, and C. They are driven by the ranges of punishment, which for A's, which are the most serious crimes, are 10 to life, B's 2 years to 20 years, and C's a year and a day to 10. Now we have a D that's a year and a day to 5 years.
Correct.
Now, any of those sentences, except a sentence that exceeds 15 years, an individual could be placed on probation for.
That's correct.
So we're making some forward progress.
Sure.
But are we able to see that as contributing to the diminished prison population?
Definitely. All the things that you just mentioned have actually contributed to a reducing prison population. I think the tough choices are the ones that are looming for Alabama. A lot of the choices that Alabama has already made have been steps that other states have engaged in, or ones that have had bipartisan consensus. I think once you've removed all that, quote, low-hanging fruit, all of the kind of the easy policy decisions, and if Alabama does not want to contribute more to the correction system, if Alabama does not want to invest in building prisons and prisons and prisons, Alabama has to go even further in reform efforts. They have to invest further into community mental health and substance abuse services. They have to invest further into more probation and actually parole officers. So it's going to be tough to get bipartisan coalescence around more criminal justice reform, and then they have to more adequately fund more and more different entities involved.
That's what I was about to say. All of that causes the money machine to have to move.
That's correct.
Briefly, will we have a special session coming up?
The only person that can call a special session is the governor. There have been rumors in Montgomery of a special session. Lately, there have been rumors that there will not be a special session. I think if there's not a special session, a lot of the next legislative session will be dominated completely by criminal justice issues. That's obviously the benefit in calling a special session, is you can isolate that. I think the danger in not having a special session is that has the potential just to completely dominate the regular session and push out a lot of other meaningful discussion on other issues.
Well, maybe it'll happen. Keep your fingers crossed. This has been Our Issues Birmingham. Thank you, Bennett, for being with us. We will see you next week.